My topic is Hamas. And I think it's important to begin by being honest about my own biases on this, since today I'm speaking as an academic and not as an intelligence professional. And I will say that I speak today to you as a strong supporter of Israel, Israel's right to exist, and cognizant as well as appreciative of its immense value as an ally of the United States. I really would like to see Israel defeat decisively its adversaries, and by that I mean Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, if possible. Now, why do I say this? I say this because I'm convinced that the exact opposite is taking place in this war. If you follow the discussion that's going on around the war between Hamas and Israel, you will have heard many who assert that it's a good opportunity now for Israel to use the assassination of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar as a justification to terminate the war and withdraw from Gaza, leaving behind a severely downgraded Hamas. And I'm here to tell you this is not going to happen. And it's not going to happen for a very simple reason, because Israel is aware that if the Israel-Hamas war was to end now, today, Hamas would actually emerge victorious. Now, why is that? Some people have made the argument, and I'm sure you've heard it, that Hamas is an idea, and if you kill all of Hamas, the idea still remains, etc. Forget about that for a moment. I'm talking about militarily. Militarily, Hamas remains strong. Even now, and we're talking now after a year of intense fighting, Hamas still fires missiles at Tel Aviv and is still able to operate in literally every sector of Gaza, which is why the IDF has to continuously, the Israel Defense Forces, the army of Israel, has to continuously revisit areas that it thought it had cleansed of Hamas. I mean, this week they're in North Gaza. I thought we were done with that, right? But apparently not. Each time this happens on the ground regularly, like clockwork, every time the IDF withdraws from a sector of Gaza, Hamas is back within about 15 minutes on average. Now, Israel has said that it's killed 17,000 militants, Hamas militants in Gaza, which I think is kind of an overestimate, but let's take that as is, right? That leaves about 15,000 more fighters out there. And not counting, by the way, the replenishing depth of Hamas, which given the demographics of the Palestinian population is actually substantial. Even if Hamas does not replenish its forces, 15,000 fighters are more than sufficient to launch a guerrilla war that can last for a long time, over a decade. So Hamas's reasoning is quite simple. Winning means surviving, even at a severely weakened state, as I'm sure you'll agree is in right now. Hamas knows that it has managed to stop Israel from achieving a decisive victory and is still surviving after a year of what is probably the most intense urban war in the history of modern Middle East. I would imagine at this point it's even exceeded the Battle of Mosul, right? Hamas leaders see that, can see what most Israelis actually can see, because what I'm telling you today is not particularly a unique position inside Israel, right? Hamas leaders can see that, the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu is faced with having to turn tactical successes in the battlefield into long-term strategic successes. But that requires establishing a credible administration inside Gaza. The problem is that the moment Israel leaves Gaza, Hamas, with Iranian assistance of course, will reestablish control. And I mean literally within hours. I'm not exaggerating with this statement. There is no other force inside Gaza, or in fact in the West Bank, for that matter, that could upstage the grassroots influence that Hamas currently has. And that's why many, again, if you've paid attention to the news, you know this, right? Many inside Netanyahu's government have expressed the desire to reoccupy parts of Gaza and even build Jewish settlements there, kind of like they've done in the West Bank. Now that's bread on the butter of Hamas, which has already shifted its modus operandi into an underground insurgency. and will continue to do so in the future. Some have suggested the establishment from some kind of interim governing authority in Gaza, funded by Arab countries, Israel, and potentially the West. But such an interim government will have to rebuild a 25 square mile version of the German city of Dresden after World War II, but with a population nearly double of what Dresden had in 1945. That's an incredibly difficult thing to do, especially when you have an underground army the size of Hamas fighting you at every step of the way, both ideologically and with an endless stream of Iranian supply weapons. In fact, one of the gains that Hamas has made since October 7 of last year is that it has managed to rid itself from the responsibility of having to administer the daily lives of 3 million people, thus allowing it to focus solely on its military tasks. So where are we now? I would argue that Sinwar's assassination, and again I'm talking about Hamas specifically here, or in fact I would say anyone's assassination, will not solve Israel's strategic problems. Right? I was actually just another side comment. I was shocked that Israel released Sinwar's video where he was killed, because the video actually shows that he died in battle and not cowering away in a tunnel, which has been the Israeli sort of like argument about Hamas leaders, right? So to me, that actually makes him more of a martyr for Palestinians because he's seen as dying in battle. I mean, it's a rookie mistake, in my opinion, for the Israelis to do. And we can talk about, how easy it is or difficult to defeat an adversary that considers death in battle as a sign of honor and not a sign of defeat, right? We can talk about this in the Q&A. But the point I want to make is that both Hamas and Hezbollah, as well as Iran, actually, are playing the long game here. Right? The strategy has a lot more strategic depth than I think we assume, and the strength has always been one of endurance, employing tactics over many generations. Meanwhile, at least to my mind, Israel appears to be engaged in a long-term regional war, which it can't afford to lose, by the way, without a way to end the war in Gaza, and it might even be the brink of a more destructive war against Hezbollah in Lebanon, not to mention Iran. Tens of thousands of Israelis are out of their homes, their economies have stagnated, and Israel's standing in the world, even in the United States, by the way, has taken a very, very serious hit. And here's what worries me the most in looking at the bigger picture. I'd like to close with this. This war is driving Palestinians and Muslims all over the world to militancy, not away from militancy, right? Consider this, nearly 80% of the global population of Muslims, right, is younger than most of us in this room, and that includes the students in this room, right? Now, given the sort of generally pacified status of Palestine for the last 18 years or so, more or less, of course there's some flare-ups and so on, but for the most part it's been kind of quiet in comparison to before. The Palestinian issue was something that most of these young Muslims knew nothing about, or very little about, right? It was a distant historical topic. Not anymore. They're now being introduced to it for the first time in their lives through this conflict. The future is going to be quite adventurous. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Why don't you join me in...
militancy. Are you talking about writ large? Are you talking about just the Sunnis? Are the Shias just as engaged? Who's getting militarized, I guess?
I mean, the Palestinian issue, I don't think, by the way, I think the biggest enemy of the Palestinians is the other Arabs, right, who don't care about them really and have left them to their fate, essentially. But putting that aside, I think, historically, Al-Qaeda was kind of largely mobilized through the Palestinian issue, at least rhetorically. I remember back in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, where there would be like those tapes that Bin Laden would issue from like some cave somewhere. And there was always, he always ended his speeches with like, so long as the Palestinians are not free, you will not see security in the West, right? So, and then it kind of died away because, there was sort of a period of quiet for more or less there's never been quiet in Gaza or the West Bank, but for a long time everybody assumed that Hamas was happy just basically ruling this little kingdom and letting everything else go. And now, I mean, the images coming out of Palestine, I mean, again, even in America, the staunchest Israeli ally is having doubts, right? So, and I'm not talking necessarily politically, like the Democrats are more like critical of Israel and the Republicans are not. I'm talking about generationally, right? I mean, I find it very hard to find any student of mine under the age of 25, 24 who is pro-Israel anymore, right? Because again, the images speak for themselves. So in thinking strategically, that's what I'm trying to say, like, you may be seeing tactical successes, right? But there's still 3 million Palestinians living in Gaza. What are you going to do? Now what are you going to do, right? Biden tried to convince the Israelis, be careful, learn from our experience in Afghanistan, but his warnings fell on deaf ears, and now anybody's guess is what's going to happen in the future.
Someone else?
This question is for you, Dr. Zay. You stated your favor for Israel in this conflict. Could you talk about some possible policy options that the United States could have to help aid Israel in this conflict?
I'm not, yeah,
So the question is, what policy options does the United States have at this point to facilitate resolution, negotiation, whatever? And maybe we can ask that question of several panelists.
Yeah, and I'm just going to say very briefly, I don't get paid enough to think of policy solutions. But like, I know this one is not going to work, right? So with that, I'm going to give it to the other panelists.
So I've read a lot in the last 48 hours. I read a lot of the material that's been produced over the course of the year. And I would say if there's a few things that seem to be consistent in all of the literature, and that is this will not bring peace to the Middle East. That we're not getting any closer. In fact, we're getting further away. With regards, and maybe Dr. Fitsanakis can talk more about Gaza, but in terms of Lebanon, this has never gone well for Israel. 82, 2000, even 2006. And there's a reason why Lebanon is called Israel's Vietnam, right? And so I think what's missing, as Joseph talked about tactics and strategy, there is no military goal in what's going on in Lebanon. The commanders are even beginning to complain, right? Bringing the 80,000 people back to their homes is not a military, goal or resolution. And so I think what's going on is he might not have an incentive for the reasons that Dr. Smith just brought. But if, and I think we should hope, if the aim is peace in the Middle East, we're not getting closer to that.
I think that very last part of what you said is, if the aim is peace, we're not going to be there. You look at the history of this region. I can go back to 47, 48, when Israel was first formed. Then you go to 67, 73. You go to the Lebanese Civil War. You go to the 06 Lebanon War between Israel. You just keep going through this process. It's going to be there. The incentive for Israel is it's an existential threat to its nation and its sovereignty. And with that, that's a strong backing for them to continue to fight. I've been in 2 wars. I don't advocate warfare as a solution to anything, but it is required at times. And so when you look at what they have to do, yeah, they may come to some sort of short term, and I say short term in a 2 years, 5 years, 10 years concept, but you're not going to rid the area of warfare anytime in our lifetime or those students' lifetime.
Yeah, I think, Mark, you've served in the military in a high level, and this will be familiar to you, the idea that when you send soldiers out, they have to have a very clear mission, because when they don't, bad things happen, right? So this reminds me of what Israel is doing right now, right? I'm going to speak as a supporter of Israel. This is important to keep in mind as I speak about this, right? This reminds me of our adventurism after 9/11, right? So we launched the war on terrorism, and I was like, what does that mean? Is somebody noticing this? Like, are we going to stop terrorism from the world? This is never going to happen. So you're sending out your soldiers for a mission that you know is going to fail, right? That's demoralizing for the soldiers. we want to give them a very clear mission, right? If the mission was, say, go out there and take out specific people of Hamas who were involved in this October 7 attack, I can understand that. And in fact, could probably be successful. Then come back and then take small steps towards making Israel more safe in the region. But a war that began, perhaps with this goal, I don't know. We've never been given an actual clear understanding what the goal here is, has now become an expansive war into Lebanon that's designed to weaken Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, and remake the Middle East in a way that is in Israel's favor. This is a very ambitious goal, and it's the kind of thing that might take years, maybe decades to do. Does Israel have the stamina to do this? With American help, yes, but America has shown, I think, in recent years, because of politicization in this country, that it doesn't have a solid mind on anything anymore, right? So one day America could be supporting you, the next day they could pull their support. Anything can happen in Washington, right? So then what do you do when you're Israel? And I'm not sure the Israelis are thinking about this as carefully as they should be.
Sunni and Shia, Saudi Arabia and Iran. And we talk about Iran taking a long fall. Eventually, something's going to happen between those two countries, Saudi Arabia and also the Emirates. Could we kind of address that for a minute? What's going to happen with that? And what are the Saudis and the Emirates doing in this conflict going on right now?
Potential Saudi-Israeli alliance.
Yeah, just a very brief point that, Hamas had certain strategic goals when they launched the October 7 attack. Among them was to stop the process of rapprochement, the process of establishing relations between Israel and the Arab states. And the week when it happened, October 7 happened, Israeli delegation was actually in Saudi Arabia trying to work out establishing relations with the kingdom, right? And that went out the window the moment that October 7 occurred. And to my knowledge, it's not in the works anymore, right? That's, for me, another strategic success of Hamas, which I hate to see. But again, that's kind of part of, I'm glad you bring up this issue. It's not just those two rivals, it's also the other powers in the Middle East, including Saudis. 11 million barrels of oil a day. That's a lot of money and power.
I think it's also put on hold conversations between the United States and Saudi Arabia concerning possible defense agreements.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another success from the Hamas perspective, I suppose.
That's actually the Crown Prince just declared that he won't be considering any negotiation, not even a deal, just negotiation until Israel stops, until there's a ceasefire.
Thanks for that, Sammy. Questions? Holy smokes. I had you on.
I was under the impression on some news reports I've read that both Hezbollah and Hamas are on the verge of defeat. And I don't get that impression from things that the board has discussed today. And this, to me, would be an appropriate time to try some kind of negotiations, if it is true or if it's phony news.
I'll echo what Dr. Fitsanakis talked about, and Hamas is, as painful as it is to say, they are at a strategic advantage, and they are winning if you focus on the destabilization aspects and the fact that if Israel were to stop fighting them today, Hamas still remains a viable fighting force. Hezbollah, what Israel, I believe, is trying to do strategically is to push them north of what's called the Blue Line or the Litani River, where they were supposed to be, since the 2006 war. So you start to look at how that plays out. No, Hezbollah and Hamas are not losing, and Israel's still struggling to achieve its military objectives, which hopefully have some sort of policy behind them.
This is actually what worries me about where we are right now. This intelligence failure, or partly intelligence failure, is that, everybody was under the impression, apparently, that Hamas was not going to do something like that. And then you had a combined arms attack by a non-state actor that made 9/11 actually exceeded the scale of 9/11 in America, right? It's a big deal. And I'm seeing the same thing now about Iran. Everything I'm reading, it says Iran is not interested in a major war. How do you know that? We said the same thing about Hamas, and yet that's not the case at all, right? And then before you know it, you have interstate warfare in the Middle East, the most volatile region in the world. I mean, as we speak, we have North Korean troops fighting on European soil. North Korean troops. If you told me that 2 years ago, a year ago, 6 months ago, I would have said you're crazy. What prevents North Korea from sending troops to Iran? Or Russia, for that matter, right? That's how world wars begin. So I think it's in the interest of everybody who is sort of like sane to try to put pressure on all the belligerents in that war to come to the negotiation table immediately. I congratulate you on asking a direct question, and many of our students who are here, great job, right? And I know where you're going with this, right? It's an important question, and I want to kind of try to give you a direct answer. First of all, I'll say 90%, 90, of all the problems we face in the world today are because of the British. Number one. With apologies to British members of the audience, right? And this is not an exception, right? But I will say another thing too. What you have had in the last 20 or so years is a kind of shifting of public opinion on both sides in Palestine and Israel to the far right, right? So you have Hamas essentially that kind of became sort of the bear took from the PLO, which was actually negotiating with Israel, even though it was also a terrorist organization. It was negotiating and had accepted Israel's right to exist. Hamas does not do that. And in return, you have in Israel the exact kind of shifting of public opinion to the far right with the settler movement. Let me remind you that the United States has declared Hamas as a terrorist organization, but it has also declared many settler groups in the West Bank as terrorist groups as well. There's a reason for it. The problem is now that these forces are in control, both in Gaza and unfortunately in Israel, because Netanyahu is such a polarizing figure inside Israel that nobody will work with him except for the settler movement, right? They're the ones that have all the power, because if they leave his government is going to fall, and he's probably going to go to prison, and he knows that, because of corruption problems in Israel. So he's dependent on them to continue the war. That's why this war seems to have no ending, right? But I guess it's important to note that in the middle of all this, there are people on both sides who want to live together, right? I mean, I know it sounds romantic, but there are still some people who believe, as I do, by the way, in the one-state solution. A federal Israel with people from all sides living together in peace and harmony. This is, I mean, it may sound crazy to you, but 100 years ago, Germany and France, there were rivers of blood. There were 2 world wars fought in those places. And now you don't even know whether you're in France or whether you're in Germany. We cannot stop hoping, right? We can't stop hoping. If we stop hoping, we've lost the game forever.